IDFC members in enabling knowledge exchange and offering capacity development on climate-related topics. Our 3 goals: to strengthen climate finance expertise and capacities, to originate and develop joint climate projects, to institutionalize and facilitate collaborative work among members on climate change. Our activity lines: knowledge sharing, capacity building, access to international climate finance, joint business opportunities. In the past couple of years, the IDFC had been supporting members in mainstream common principles on mitigation and adaptation, developing a framework for the operationalization of the Paris Agreement alignment, promoting a mentoring program between institutions, delivering climate toolbox including GHG accounting, climate risk assessment, Paris Agreement alignment and climate strategy, offering trainings on climate risk assessment, climate strategies, and adaptation, supporting events and partnerships to the international agenda, mobilizing resources and facilitating joint business opportunities and project proposal. IDFC Climate Facility. Let's work together to implement the Sustainable Development Goals towards 2030 and beyond. What is IDFC? The International Development Finance Club, created in 2011, is a network of 26 public development banks. Our mission? Speaking with a common voice, to leverage a greater impact in major international debates, and to contribute to the implementation of the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Our goals? Knowledge sharing and capacity building among the IDFC institutions, enhanced collaboration between members and partners, and pursuing advocacy on the role of public development banks. How does it work? All year long, the club is working on contributing to the international agenda, coordinating working groups on SDGs, gender, climate, and biodiversity, releasing common strategic and operational publications, and reporting their annual commitment towards climate and biodiversity. IDFC. Let's work together to implement the Sustainable Development Goals towards 2030 and beyond. What is IDFC Climate Facility? Created in 2019, the facility has been supporting IDFC members in enabling knowledge exchange and offering capacity development on climate-related topics. Our 3 goals: to strengthen climate finance expertise and capacities, to originate and develop joint climate projects, to institutionalize and facilitate collaborative work among members on climate change. Our activity lines: knowledge sharing, capacity building, access to international climate finance, joint business opportunities. In the past couple of years, the IDFC had been supporting members in mainstream common principles on mitigation and adaptation, developing a framework for the operationalization of the Paris Agreement alignment, promoting a mentoring program between institutions, delivering climate toolbox including GHG accounting, climate risk assessment, Paris Agreement alignment and climate strategy, offering trainings on climate risk assessment, climate strategies, and adaptation, supporting events and partnerships to the international agenda, mobilizing resources and facilitating joint business opportunities and project proposal. IDFC Climate Facility. Let's work together to implement the Sustainable Development Goals towards 2030 and beyond. What is IDFC? The International Development Finance Club, created in 2011, is a network of 26 public development banks. Our mission? Speaking with a common voice to leverage a greater impact in major international debates and to contribute to the implementation of the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Our goals? Knowledge sharing and capacity building among the IDFC institutions, enhanced collaboration between members and partners, and pursuing advocacy on the role of public development banks. How does it work? All year long, the club is working on contributing to the international agenda, coordinating working groups on SDGs, gender, climate, and biodiversity, releasing common strategic and operational publications, and reporting their annual commitment towards climate and biodiversity. IDFC. Let's work together to implement the Sustainable Development Goals towards 2030 and beyond. What is IDFC Climate Facility? Created in 2019, the facility has been supporting IDFC members in enabling knowledge exchange and offering capacity development on climate-related topics. Our 3 goals: to strengthen climate finance expertise and capacities, to originate and develop joint climate projects, to institutionalize and facilitate collaborative work among members on climate change. Our activity lines: knowledge sharing, capacity building, access to international climate finance, joint business opportunities. In the past couple of years, the IDFC had been supporting members in mainstream common principles on mitigation and adaptation, developing a framework for the operationalization of the Paris Agreement alignment, promoting a mentoring program between institutions, delivering climate toolbox including GHG accounting, climate risk assessment, Paris Agreement alignment, and
So, very good afternoon to all of you at the IDFC Pavilion here at COP28. So I know it's lunchtime, some of you might still be hungry, but I know that we can feed you something interesting here, so which might supplement your lunch, might be a dessert. Because the topic is nature finance, is climate finance. We just discussed it, might be the other way around as well, and we already had a big discussion. But we keep the title, Nature Finance is Climate Finance, and I think it's pretty obvious that we have 2 really substantial planetary challenges that we're trying to tackle. We've been discussing climate, the climate challenge, the climate crisis for a long time. We've worked over decades to find solutions, to mobilize funds, and to create impact. We've tried the same with biodiversity, but I think for biodiversity, only the last COP in Montreal gave us a kickstart. Yeah, that's actually my impression, that the Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework, gave everyone in the community in all the sectors a push to think even more about what can we do to protect biodiversity and nature and to meet the challenge of the planetary boundary that we are about to breach. So we believe that nature and climate go together. It's 2 challenges which might have 1.5 solutions together. Some are only for climate, some are only for nature, but most are together. And that's what we're going to discuss today in this group that we've assembled here. So we have 5 representatives who will make up the panel later. 3 from development banks. Mr. Pertner, IPCC co-author of the second, the second part of the 6th assessment report, who will give us scientific insight into what we are discussing today. And Mr. Andrew Deutz from TNC, Climate Policy Director, if I'm not mistaken, who will bring in the perspective from huge, maybe the biggest conservation NGO that we have in the world. So this is the panel. I will introduce the 3 participants from the development banks as they join us on the panel, and would like to ask Mr. Pöttner to give us your presentation first, so that we are all up to speed, on content.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the opportunity, and thanks a lot for your interest in financing nature. It's a very important activity. It's an activity which at the same time is under time pressure. The time pressure in a way also comes from climate mitigation needs and keeping to the 1.5 degree of global warming limit. And what we've done when working in the IPCC and doing the first ever official collaboration between IPCC and IPBES was prepare a workshop report on how to tackle climate and biodiversity together, and considering their societal impacts. The point to be made here, and that we see this as obligatory, and that whenever you do either one of them, you should consider the other sector and should consider synergies and trade-offs. And the findings from this workshop report that you see represented in the second line there, the IPBES IPCC report, made it into the later products during the 6th assessment cycle, where we produced 3 special reports: ocean cryosphere, land, and then the 1.5 report. That was the first one of the special reports, and then the main working group reports. And especially in the working group report, we developed a systemic picture, a holistic picture that provides guidelines, and that should be guidelines also for the financial sector in terms of where to invest and where not. And the systemic picture really came from this view of that we have 3 major global systems, considering the human society as a major driver of what is happening on the planet, and the interaction between climate and biodiversity and human society being in an imbalance currently due to human activities. And the imbalance is indicated by the thick red arrows here, where human society has impacts on climate. As we know, climate feeds back on ecosystems, and there's direct impacts of human society on ecosystems in terms of destructions. And this considers and this represents the current polycrisis that we have: climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, pollution, and so forth. And we need measures that are turning the curve, that are bending the curve, and bring us back to sustainability, assuming that we've ever had it. The picture here is representing essentially the climate impacts, the options, the decision options, the choices that we have now. And we are essentially handing over to the next generations the consequences of our decisions, and who is born today will see the end of the century and will either see the worst outcomes or will see some transitioning to a more beneficial future, depending on the degree of global warming. And the WWF has complemented that this is not just about us. It's also about the other species coexisting with us on the planet, and they're actually part of the important ecosystem services that represent the foundation of life on the planet and the foundation of our very existence and our healthy existence. Because if we don't do anything, the future we are having ahead of us is not a very pleasant one, neither for us nor for the other species affected by climate change, where you see with the degree of global warming, there are heat extremes developing, especially in the low latitudes, where species are exposed to lethal living conditions. Essentially what this means, they are losing habitat, and we are already seeing a trend of animal life retreating from the tropics. And to keep that under control, there's only one way to do that. It's emissions reduction, which is a baseline requirement for actually also for biodiversity conservation and rebuilding nature. We are just one species in the animal kingdom. I mean, it's a statement of modesty that we all should have in some respects, because the mammalian group, and we are one of those, is also very vulnerable due to heat-humidity combinations challenging our capacity to regulate our body temperature. And you see with these intensifying red colors from left to right into a warm climate future, that the number of days with lethal conditions for us and other mammals is increasing with the degree of global warming. And essentially that also means that human habitat is lost, especially for those humans that are existing outside, that have no technical means of adaptation to undertannel the challenges associated with climate change. You can imagine what are the sort of the next level consequences in terms of losing human habitat, in terms of migration movements and so forth, and the associated challenges for those countries that have to take up that moving human population, including the loss of wealth and financial resources for those that have to migrate. There's one important aspect here. We are talking about the funding of nature, but I would like to tie climate and nature together even more firmly, because when you look at this slide and the top globe, this is the current climate where during the hot months of the year we already see a constraint on the productivity of ecosystems in terms of being able to take up CO2. And this concerns some of the key systems, the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and also boreal forests. And if you take us into the future, 2040, and until then, it really doesn't really matter which scenario you take, you see that this trend is exacerbating. And as we are surpassing as 1.5, it will be exacerbating even further. And you see that in this slide where we have a depiction of productivity across latitudes, and the blue curve is representing what we came from. The orange curve is where we are currently. We are already seeing a dampening of climate effects on the capacity of nature to remove the CO2. So any discussion to sort of dispose of CO2 into nature-based solutions is kind of coming late. It's important, but we need to emphasize, yes, we want that service, but for that we have to do successful emissions reduction. And then we can benefit from this and have a sustainable future where nature can support climate stabilization in the long term. There is no short-term fix by nature. It's a long-term commitment and task to do this. With climate change, all of these services that nature provides are under challenge. It starts with pollination, coastal protection as the coral reefs are going, tourism, recreation, devastation of nature by climate extremes is certainly interfering with that, food sources, health, water filtration, clean air, and climate regulation. These are services that nature provides to us that we take for granted and where we don't really pay for the damage we are doing in terms of the goods and services that we are buying. But there is a perspective. If we are 100% responsible for what we are doing, we can also fix it. We have to develop the will and the engagement and the enthusiasm to do this. And moving to the positive interaction here in this whole system slide between human systems, future climate, and ecosystems, we are emphasizing concepts like planetary health, where what we are doing should support the various health aspects, which means human health, ecosystem health, and then the health of the whole system, planetary health, all together. This would require changes, transformational changes in virtually all systems that are involved here. This in the various human systems, from technology, industry to societal structure, ecosystems, climate stabilization. And I know we are more inclined to look at incremental adaptation measures where we do the small steps one after the other, But we should not think in sectors, in silos here. We have to think across in order to really trigger the fast change that we need. And there needs to be governance, there needs to be finance, knowledge and capacity, catalyzing conditions, and technologies that are actually supporting this transformation. Now, how does such a brilliant future, if we can talk about a brilliant future in a 1.5 degree warmer world, would look like? It would look like a mosaic landscape where we have spaces that are protected for biodiversity with a high priority, and that concerns 30 to 50% of the area in land, freshwater, and ocean systems. And they are connected, species can migrate, and there are spaces that we share. Human species shares with biodiversity and other spaces where we have intensive uses, and that goes across all systems. So there's an analogy how we can deal with the different systems and considering the guidelines. This involves transforming cities, including blue and green spaces in cities, and it's in a way beneficial that cities will hold 2/3 of the world's population by mid-century, because they are then not moving about in nature and destroying nature further. But it's really beneficial also to have nature-based and engineering approaches together in cities, establishing green and blue spaces for city climates, even doing urban agriculture, and building social safety nets for disaster management, and moving towards wider benefits, public health improvements, and ecosystem conservation. And already we have a situation that because of the pollution activities in the open landscape, cities are a harbor for some biodiversity, and they are retreats for biodiversity. So there are some guidelines how we could go about, and whenever you finance any projects that want to rebuild nature, I think these guidelines should be in the back of your minds. You know, is it the mosaic spatial planning? Is that considered? Sort of the conservation of biodiversity, conservation of carbon-rich habitats, consideration of adaptation limits, which are driving current changes and fatalities, and whatever is done in terms of compensatory measures, we need a net gain for biodiversity. So we cannot just say, oh, we minimize damage and we just move on, because then the curve would not bend. Whatever we do, we need to rebuild biodiversity at the same time in the place where we interfere or in other places. We would have land gain because the human behavior needs to change, human food consumption needs to change, moving away from meat and milk consumption, considering that we use 80% of our cultured land for the production of animal feed is just outrageous. And we need to free some of this land for biodiversity and for securing human food production based on plant-based food. And certainly the integration of human interests is important all along. We have options listed in the reports. You can consult the reports. We talk about adaptation, mitigation options, how they interact, their feasibility, their effectiveness, the synergies, and to some extent trade-offs. For some strong financial benefits, as indicated by the blue areas. That analysis was possible, especially on the mitigation side. And there are benefits in terms of reducing the biodiversity damage in the context of reducing climate change. That the concern that many people currently have, that you lose wealth if you go into climate mitigation and transformation, is just not justified, because some findings by McKinsey or World Bank indicate you can have similar or higher economic growth by 2030 in low emission scenarios. So the transformation obviously works, whereas individual sectors have concerns abandoning their business as usual models. So in terms of action is needed to bring us back below risk thresholds and have healthy systems that really work of us concerning biodiversity, forest cover, freshwater chemical and plastic pollution, and also nutrient pollution. So nature-based solutions are important. We need to get started on them. They will not fix the climate problem for us short-term, very clearly. Climate mitigation, emissions reduction is something you from the financial sector should really be pushing for policy, because to maintain the integrity of how the different systems work on the planet. So finance need to target emissions reductions, and adaptation and climate and biodiversity action need to go together and be coordinated. This is just emphasizing the system transitions, and if you look at that, you know, on the left-hand side, the ecosystem, then the infrastructure and the energy and the industry, it's really everything that's affected by the transformation, and a whole system view is helpful in making the right investment decisions. And to close with this, any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable and healthy future for all. The time for action and based on the right decisions is really now. And as I said, our reports, the national and the international ones, offer solutions, considering that it is getting late to implement that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, very, very well, Mr. Partner. It was a concise but complex picture that you painted for us, and I think everyone is overwhelmed by this complexity, since you were just saying it's a transformation that affects each and every system. And I think what we're going to do now is look at it and try to break it down a bit, yeah, so that it becomes a little more palpable, yeah, for institutions who are playing a role, yeah, but not making mistakes on the way. And I think that's really the task, because we had a meeting this morning where we, in the end, said, okay, we're in the middle of a search process, yeah, how to do it right. And we know we have to do it fast, yeah. So, and if you're too fast, then you make mistakes. So it's a very delicate thing that we are doing right now. Honestly, I have to apologize before we start the panel, because there is a virtual participant, and since she was not on my screen, I forgot to introduce her. So I'm really sorry if she can listen to us right now. I know that she is on. Ah, here you are, very well. So that's she's Leslie Capon from Astanor Ventures, which is a capital investor who has worked out metrics and KPIs to actually cover impacts that are being achieved through their investments. And so that's another private sector contribution that we're having today on our panel. But let's get started with the panel. I would like to ask ladies first. So Alicia Montalvo from CAF, let me read out your title, and I wanted to ask you where it comes from. She is Climate Action and, now listen, Positive Biodiversity Manager at CAF.
That's right.
That's right. Okay, which is the Latin American Development Bank, which is a member of IDFC. And just tell us, why is it a positive biodiversity manager? What's a negative biodiversity manager doing?
Well, this is part of the discussion today, and that's why this is in my title, Positive Biodiversity, to make clear that in the Latin American, the Caribbean Bank, we really believe that positive is always, or should be always, a positive. The 40% of the biodiversity is in Latin American and Caribbean region, so it's clear that we need to work to protect it, to make a good use of it, and to restore it. And what I consider is interesting is that biodiversity is not like a little brother or sister of the climate change, but is instead something that goes beyond. It's very, very interesting to know that in the global biodiversity framework that was adopted in Canada coming last year, one of the most important things is that we need to search for the harmony between with the nature. And I think that climate change, the problem of climate change is that we have broken this harmony. In fact, climate change is a consequence of a misuse of nature, a misuse of the limits of the environment. So I think that now the movie is changing to some extent. I see all these negotiations. I have been in climate change negotiations for many years, many. And I see now an evolution. The point of view is changing, and I think this is good news. Now biodiversity is in the center of the discussion. So congratulations for promoting this discussion. The bad news is that still we consider that financing for biodiversity has to be done as part of financing of climate change. Sometimes we consider, I was this morning in a discussion on nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions was an invention to really make possible that deforestation was part of the climate change conversations, because otherwise forests would not be in this conversation. Of course, all the red plus, all these nature elements were important, but when these nature-based solutions was included in the climate change convention, at that moment, we began to look at the biodiversity from a different way. And now I think things are evolving, and I think that the voice of Latin American and Caribbean countries now is more relevant in the discussions. In fact, we are having this year a pavilion. We are very happy to be part of the IDFC, but we thought that could be very important to have our own pavilion to really have this voice very strong. And we are working on the basis that the ecosystems are part of the solution, not only because they contribute to capture CO2 emission or to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but also because they are important by themselves, as has been stressed by the professor. We need to learn about the ecosystemic services, all the services you have mentioned, but also water is very important, agriculture, you mentioned that. So I think that we are changing a little bit the view, and I think it's very relevant.
Very nice. So I can see the word positive is triggering a lot of ideas and thoughts. So let me ask Boitumelo Mosako, the Chief Executive of DBSA, the Southern African Region Development Bank, to join us on the panel. So I hope you have a similarly positive attitude to the topic and to the work of DBSA. And now for the men, Mr. Stefan Wintels, CEO, positive CEO of KfW Group. Yeah. And please, Andrew Deutz already mentioned you before, and now read out your full title, Director of Global Policy, Institutions and Conservation Finance at TNC. So that's a little more complex than just the climate finance title I gave you before. And Professor Fördert, you are also welcome to join us on the panel. So there might be some scientific evidence that we would like to add to the discussion when we are veering off the right track. So let's start off, say with an entry question, Mr. Wintels. We wanted to discuss what is the role of public development banks to contribute to achieving what Professor Fördert and all his colleagues have scientifically proven should be done in the world. We know we are not doing it today, but we should be doing it. So what is KfW, what do you have in store and actually to get us into that direction?
So thanks for the question, Peter. And before I answer your question, I learned that I need to come across certain statements, but only 3 statements. Number 1, this is really urgent. I think for the first time on this conference, at least, I felt the sense of urgency has really increased. And I heard a lot of times, time is our enemy. And that is good. But it should not be translated into panic, but into positive actions. So that is point number 2. Point number 1. Point number 2 is it's important, although this is a climate conference, that we think biodiversity at the same time. And that is happening as well, not because of this panel, but generally the sense has changed. And thirdly, I think we have all stakeholders here and a lot of leaders. And I think this decade of decision, as I call it, is not only an inflection point for this planet, but it's also a moment of truth for leadership. Leaders in the world, whether at the policy level, at the corporate level, and at any level, needs to be taken their responsibility within their responsibility. right? That is very, very important. Everybody has a responsibility. And everybody needs to be reminded that this is a decade of responsibility. Otherwise, we will not move ahead, from my understanding. So the role of development banks and KfW specifically, I would mention another 3 points. That's easy. First and foremost, we need further increase the awareness. When I speak also with other executives, people are currently overwhelmed by the poly crisis, including the climate crisis, by the complexity, the uncertainty, etc., etc. And now on top, biodiversity as a new term. It's not new, of course, but as a new kid on the block comes on top. So that needs to change. And we ideally need to integrate climate into biodiversity into the second point, create frameworks which are simple, but which gives guidance to executives who takes the decision. Mm-hmm. It's not scientific people who take the daily decisions. It's often not policymakers who take the decision. It's people who run business. So they need the framework, and I think KfW and others can assist, and we shouldn't wait for regulations. And thirdly, we need a lot of money. We need massive investments into climate and biodiversity. And that is the big unknown at the moment, because everybody is speaking about mobilizing private capital. It's already a challenge on climate, although it's a very simple KPI in terms of CO2. But on biodiversity, to mobilize private funds, I have to say personally, I still struggle to do it in a scale needed in this decade. There are a lot of small and encouraging projects from our understanding we can discuss, but it highly depends on public money and philanthropic money, and often the ratio is 7-1 and not 1-7, which should be the ratio which we target. So these are the 3 points: awareness, framework, mobilizing funds and capital.
And Ken, just as a follow-up question, what are the first steps that KfW has been taking to work on these three topics?
The easy answer is that is the commercial. We are the largest biodiversity financier in the world, 3.7 billion, and that's very positive. But of course, compared to the challenge, it's a relatively small amount. But we have a good starting point. We have credibility. We have made investments, a lot of public money. The next answer then is we are not there where we need to be. And at the board, we decided in the summer to do what we have done on climate with a very scientific approach to translate our behavior into sector guidelines, to try to do the same on biodiversity. Because we need this framework. We need to assess decisions against targets or KPIs, whatever, and that we call biodiversity roadmap. Hopefully we have some results by the mid of next year. And that's a major investment on our side because the complexity is so high, and translate this into a bank's balance sheet is not simple. But these are the 2 major points, I would say.
Yeah, thank you very much. So before I ask DBSA to come up with the South African perspective, I wondered whether Leslie can contribute a bit to this question of making things feasible or being ready to take decisions that at least do no harm and at best do a lot of good. So maybe you can tell us a little bit, how are you doing it at your company? I mentioned the KPIs that you've been working on. How does it work for you?
Yeah, no, a great question, and I think it's essential. As you know, we an impact VC fund focused on the agri-food sector. And so the reason why, in fact, I joined Astana 5 years ago was to say, okay, how are we going to tell our investors that we've done a good job, that we've been positively impacting the agri-food sector? And so that's really where we focused our attention over the last 5 years on developing those KPIs that allow us to understand what is the positive impact, net positive impact, that all portfolio companies are going to have on the people on the planet. So the way that we look at it, we have 5 core KPI. The first one is about the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The second one is about the reduction of freshwater use. The third one is the positive impact on biodiversity, and I can tell you more about how we measure that.
Cool.
That's all 3 planet KPI. And then we have 2 people KPI, because the agri sector is not only about the planet, but it's also about its people. So we have 2 people KPI being social and health. So again, going back to biodiversity, that's definitely a bit more complex than freshwater or than greenhouse gas emissions nowadays, but it's becoming easier and easier. It's important to keep in mind that we are an early stage investor, so we invest in young, mission-driven entrepreneurs that have identified a problem and found a solution. So what we assess is how this solution is going to have a net positive impact. And for that, we use tools such as life cycle assessment, LCA, which give us a really clear idea that all solutions compared to what they replace. One easy example is plant-based alternative. If you replace chicken or beef with a plant-based alternative, we can compute, thanks to life cycle assessment, the avoidance of land use, the avoidance of water eutrophication, acidification. So we can use these metrics to understand the positive impact that all portfolio companies have on the planet as well as its people.
Can you give us an idea of the size of your operation?
Sure, yeah, definitely. So we are, so maybe a little bit about Astana for sure. We are based in Europe, but we also in the US. We closed our second fund, a 364 million fund, in which, in fact, both our funds, we have the pleasure to count KfW as an investor. And KfW is not the only one. We have the pleasure to have EIF, the European Investment Fund, but also VPI. We manage today 800 million. So we're a significant actor in the space of the agri-food sector. And we have invested in 45 companies along the value chain. So what we tend to say is that we invest from the soil to the gut. So it's in a way one step further than farm to fork. So we start with healthy soil and we finish with healthy people. And so just to give you an idea of the type of companies we will invest in, at the beginning of value chain, we will invest in companies such as Affair Bio in Belgium, which is a biostimulant and biocontrol, an electrical autonomous structure in the US, a sustainable packaging, and you hopefully had the pleasure to discover it during the COP, because actually if you go to all the food courts, if you check the packaging that is used, it's actually a NOTPLA packaging, which is a seaweed-based packaging, which is fully compostable. But it also will be companies such as plant-based alternative or companies that will support healthy diet for the consumers.
Thank you very much. So I think it's always good to have positive examples, yeah, because then you learn from them, you might replicate or you just build them into something new, yeah, that hasn't happened before. So can I ask you, Boitumelo, to tell us a little bit what's happening at DBSA in this space? I know DBSA is really a significant bank in Southern Africa. You are running many big programs, and you are one of the most important members of the IDFC club. So what's happening at your institution regarding climate change and nature finance?
Thank you for the question. You know, the angle where I'm sitting, I'm looking at that number over there, and it says $18 billion in biodiversity finance in 2022. And I think as we sit here today, that's a powerful message around what development finance institutions, you know, are doing in this space. And I think we need to applaud the IDFC members for the work that they're doing. And I do agree more has to be done. From a DBSA perspective, we are of the view that ecological infrastructure is just as important as engineering, as institutional, and because we are involved in network industries, and by that I mean we are in transport, we are in energy, we are in water, we are in digital infrastructure as well, education and health. What we have firstly acknowledged is the importance of biodiversity in our decision-making, in our investment decision-making, because nature connects all of us and everything is connected to nature. So if we do not embed biodiversity in our decision-making, we stand the risk of unintended consequences from the decisions that we are making today. And that is the first thing. The second thing was then to say we acknowledge. Second thing is then to say, In acknowledgement, we then have to create an enabling environment. What does that mean? We then, developed our own biodiversity strategy as an institution based on TFD principles to then say this is how we are then gonna go about it. On the execution, then there's the execution, and then there's the monitoring and evaluation side of it. So I will then, touch on what we have done in this space. Firstly, we have leveraged partnerships, and I think partnerships are a key thing in this. We have provided direct investment together with our South African National Biodiversity Institute, where we have, provided finance, partnering with GCF into ecological, infrastructure in two of our provinces in South Africa. In addition to that, we have also adopted, not just because we believe, like our dear scientist said, there's multiple pathways, and we need to follow a parallel approach to solutioning. So there's a project by project basis that we follow, which is what I've mentioned on the Sunby side. The second thing that we have done in this space is to then follow a programmatic approach. A programmatic approach enables speed, enables scale, and most importantly, a programmatic approach creates a platform for private sector participation. We have partnered with the GCF around water reuse, where we have secured to the tune of $235 million US. But what is interesting about that is that there's an element that goes to project preparation, and there's an element that goes to implementation as well. Because just as much as we talk about mobilizing private sector funding, we also have to create development capacity around that. There is the opportunity that I'd like to share, that is there with the Jeff's Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. So that has been created by Jeff as well. And we are looking to also, leverage this facility as well to provide concessional funding, and then, partner with the public sector and the private sector in our area. Another opportunity that is there is that our mandate has also been extended beyond South Africa, our GCF mandate, geographical mandate. So we have an opportunity now to even extend these programs beyond South Africa. Thank you.
What just crossed my mind is when we talk about banks, so one of the core competencies of banks is to manage risk. Yeah, so you need to know your risk. Yeah, so that's one thing. And you mentioned TNFD, as an initiative, which I guess is known here in the audience as well. If not, please ask a question. Which should bring risks that are nature related into the banking operations. So that's one thing. And you said you are working with that. Yeah, and I know KfW is working with that. So it's the same track. But then we also talk about impact. So we want to manage a bank according to risk, but we also want to manage according to impact. Yeah. So how do we do this? Is there any thinking on this? I don't know, Alicia, have you thought about this? Yeah, because then you have two drivers. Yeah. How do you manage that?
No, thank you very much. And I think that the comments made by Peter and by her are really the ideas I wanted to stress, because we know how important is biodiversity, as I mentioned at the beginning, but it's very difficult really to land these questions when you need to talk with countries and to identify projects. I was thinking that one key question has to do with science and data. Something that happened with climate change is that when science was really very clear and conclusive, decisions were easier. But now, perhaps with the biodiversity, we are still at the beginning of this way. I think that we need to work in science and data. You have been talking of impact, and we don't have enough data right now. And I think this is something that we need to work further. and to make a good use of digital instruments for that. I think that now we have the opportunity, for instance, to gather information, the geolocalization, artificial intelligence. We have tools that could be very useful for identifying the impact and gaps in biodiversity, and I think that we need to really translate these science challenges in real data. So the second thing you have mentioned has to do with risk, the TNFD. I think we are also working on that. It's crucial, because unless you are able to really, when you talk with the ministers of finance, as Peter said, that they have to take the loans, and then they say they really don't know if this is they really don't understand that this is an investment they need to do to really protect the biodiversity. The agriculture, as I mentioned, the fishery has to do with the protection of the people living there, the water. So I think that we need to further work in all these elements to really make possible that biodiversity is translated in projects. And this is a problem we are having right now, because this is not included in the operation, the biodiversity loss risk, and also the information. And sometimes there is a mixture between biodiversity adaptation. So it's really very difficult to find the key performance indicators we need to really prove that we're moving in the right way. Sometimes the problem is that we don't have the elements. So I was looking also at the data here, 18 billion in biodiversity and 245 billion in mitigation. Right. So we have a problem here. So I think that we need really to further reflect on that. I think we are in CAF, what we are doing is to have an approach now, which is an ecosystemic approach. What we are now trying to do is not only to use the country by country approach, but we are working in an approach that considers the ecosystem from a broader point of view. For instance, it's very clear in the Amazon, but also in the Patagonia, with mangroves, with paramos. I think it's important that we learn how to work looking at the problem from another perspective. And this is the perspective that really the countries, when you talk with them, when you talk with the authorities in the finance ministries, or of course the environment ministries, they really, we need to translate all these elements we are talking about in the real benefits that people will get out of our investments. Right. For instance, in terms of better, more resources for fishery, better revenues for agriculture, more revenues for tourism. And we need to make this work. Also, I think that we are at the beginning of the way, but we are making good progress. Positive, always positive.
I would like to pose a question to you, Professor Pörtner, and also to Leslie online. That is the data point, because you mentioned it. And let's see which one works better. The question of data, because we know decision making requires good data. So what would you say from a scientific point of view? Is there good data available for investment decisions that is on the micro level? Yeah, for what we discuss here, nature and climate investments? And then I would like to ask Leslie, what's your experience? I mean, you're doing it. You have your KPIs and you have your investees, and so you probably discover data gaps at that point. But Professor Pörtner, and I noticed you wanted to make a comment, so please.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very relevant discussion, and I really appreciate how scientific information is appreciated and valued in the in the discussion. This, if you follow the current climate debate, you have the impression that clear guidance provided by the scientific information on where we should be going with respect to climate protection and mitigation is pushed to the side if it comes to national interest and especially economic interests being defended. People don't want to give up the traditional business model, and that really is counterproductive in terms of also for the motivation of the scientific community to provide the relevant information. It's a lot of effort. I mean, I've just invested 8 years into IPCC work. We have produced major assessment reports. No financial compensation associated with that, and then you see that the political will is not following, and and I see the same risks for the biodiversity sector. That is a problem that policymakers do see this as optional and not as existentially needed, and this is a dilemma. We have already in the 1.5 special report in 2018 said that the bottleneck is political will, and I think your profession, because policymakers are driven by the number of votes, they're driven by economic well-being of the population. I think your sector would be very important in order to increase the motivation for policymakers to take action, and I take your word for it that you are really appreciating the scientific information coming.
I'm going to ask Mr. Wintels how he will convince the German government of taking this more seriously.
Yes.
So.
I think the German government actually, I mean, if I look at the optimism of our state secretaries with respect to still being able to keep to the 1.5 degree global warming limit, the optimism, it may be opportunistic, but it's impressive nonetheless. Your second point, data requirements. What I said with respect to political will is decisive, and the data we have available in the climate context, the quality of those data is exceptional, and still policy thinks that they can override what the data tell us. And so that we should keep in mind that the political will here on the biodiversity side will be equally important, and the pressure will be needed, and the data need to be collected not only in terms of the biodiversity by itself, but also in terms of the climate benefits, in terms of the human health benefits, and the spatial planning for maintaining a healthy human population and healthy wildlife, the role of wildlife, and for example in ecosystem functioning. Just yesterday saw a new paper on that rewilding nature is actually helping carbon storage. So there are co-benefits to be exploited that we should emphasize. And yes, there needs to be monitoring, and the trends need to be scientifically evaluated and assessed. And we have the core bodies, IPCC and IPBES, in place for doing that, and the data in that connection are essential information, because they provide the confidence in our conclusions.
So Leslie, are you using IPCC data for your investment decisions?
Not directly in a way, because again, we're investing in a super early stage companies, but by definition, what's built into LCA's models, they use a bit of IPCC data, I will say, behind. It takes a lot of time on data, that's for sure. I mean, we spend a lot of time assessing the real environmental and social impact that our solutions are bringing to the market. And this is not an easy exercise, that's for sure. I mean, even at a single product. So, you know, like I can imagine for larger companies in the industry is becoming even more difficult. But for us, that's what we spend most of our time, because we have to demonstrate to our investors that we've done a good choice. You know, we, at the end of the day, we're an impact fund, so we report both on our return on investment and we report on our return on impact. You know, we have these double metrics. And in fact, what we realized that, you know, when we're talking to our investors and telling them we're avoiding X amount of emissions, we're avoiding that square meter of land and that many farmers were reached, that doesn't really resonate with our investors. Our investors, what they tend to understand is money. So what we've done is that actually we're translating all our net positive impact into a monetary value. So it's really like an exercise of impact valuation, meaning that at the end of the life of the fund, what we will be able to tell to our investors, and just to say they are part of the discussion, they're part of our advisory committee, so they know exactly what we're doing and how this impact valuation model is working. We will be able to tell them that actually we provided like a 4x on return on investments, and we gave them an 8x on return. Like for each euro that we invested, we had a positive impact of 8 euros, for instance.
Very nice, very interesting. So the valuation of impacts is another step, yeah, and another challenge. So Andrew, I didn't forget you. Sorry, you've been sitting here taking notes, and I'm pretty sure a lot of things have gone through your mind. So let's try to turn it back to the original question of nature finance as climate finance and scaling up. So what's TNC's way and strategy of doing this?
Sure, we've got a couple of different things that we're working on, but let me just start by saying I've been working in both the climate and biodiversity world since, well, my whole career. And there's been a really significant evolution, particularly the last couple of years. Originally, in the climate discussions, nature was a victim. And now nature is seen as a solution provider. But the financing hasn't caught up, right? The latest estimates is that nature can provide somewhere between around a third of the near-term mitigation opportunities needed to stay on a 1.5 degree trajectory by 2030, but less than 10% of the funding goes to nature-based solutions. I've also sat in a lot of rooms over the years where people have said, we need a technology solution. We need to invest in carbon capture. We need to invent a machine that can capture carbon out of the atmosphere, store it safely for decades or centuries, and self-replicate across 6 continents. Nature invented that machine 300 million years ago. It's called a tree. So we've developed the systems on RED, trying to figure out how to stop deforestation. We're doing a lot on, we collectively, I don't mean just the Nature Conservancy, the climate and biodiversity worlds. The climate world has finally kind of woken up to the investability and the necessity of investing in nature. At the Nature Conservancy, we've got a couple of things that we're doing in particular. And I'll say, we did a study a couple of years ago on the financing needs for biodiversity, which put the need at somewhere around $700 billion a year. But the biggest ways to close that gap are first removing harmful subsidies, so just stop harming nature. And secondly, investing in infrastructure. So the agriculture and infrastructure sectors become critical. And I would sort of echo a point that Boy Mello had earlier about the importance of ecological infrastructure. So just a couple of examples of some of the things we're working on. The debt for nature swaps that we've done, fairly well known. I'll give one example in Belize, where we basically help Belize refinance its entire Eurobond portfolio of about $500 million at a lower interest rate thanks to credit enhancement provided by one of your members. And that was the magic to get them from near default to credit worthiness and therefore get institutional investors to be able to buy the new debt. But that refinancing generated about $150 million in savings, which was then reinvested in marine conservation, primarily for protection of the Mesoamerican reef. That's a nice conservation story, but the reason Belize wanted to invest in the reef is because it's an essential economic asset for the tourism and fisheries industries, which were 2 of the largest foreign currency generators, right? So servicing their debt means they need foreign currency, and the ecological infrastructure was essential for the economic development. They figured out a way to monetize that. A second example, we worked in a little further up the coast in Cozumel, just near Cancun. We worked with the government of Quintana Roo to develop what we think is the world's first parametric insurance policy on a coral reef. The payment for the premiums on that was paid for out of the tax revenue that the government got from the hotel owners, because they charge a bed tax on the tourists that come. 2 years later, there was a hurricane and there was a payout, which was kind of cool. But the real innovation was the fact that the local hotel owners recognized that the reef was providing physical protection for their $3 billion worth of hotel infrastructure and the 100+ thousand jobs that were dependent on that in the region. Again, recognizing nature as an infrastructure asset and then figuring out how to invest in that. And a third quick example, I'll turn to South Africa, where we're working in Cape Town on what we call a water fund, which is basically figuring out both the math, the economics, and the governance structure to get urban water users to pay for upper watershed conservation or interventions, because it's cheaper than building a water filtration plant, so you improve water security. But in the case of Cape Town, the real intervention is actually a biodiversity conservation measure. It's getting rid of the invasive species that are soaking up the water and preventing the watershed from doing what it normally does, which is provide water downstream. We've had support from a couple of MDBs in setting these up, CAF, but in particular Inter-American Development Bank, and IFAD, helping set these up in a number of places around the world. But again, it comes from the recognition of nature as infrastructure and figuring out how to make that an investable asset.
Andrew,
I'll just end by saying, I'll hold there, we'll come back.
Yeah. Oh, now she's gone? I was just going to, now she's gone, okay. Now I was just going to go back to Leslie.
No, I'm here.
Oh, you're here without a picture, okay.
Exactly.
You're back, okay. Now, because I was told that your phone is running out of power, and so we have to somehow say goodbye to you and pose the last question, or ask you whether you have a question that you wanted to pose.
No, I can stay. I mean, in fact, my computer ran out of battery, but hopefully I have my phone for the next 25 minutes. So I'm happy to stay if you're happy to keep me for a bit longer.
Okay, fine. Then, yeah, of course, we will. We're really enthusiastic. So just, Andrew, just as a follow-up, since, I mean, it's great to hear these examples. Yeah, and it also sounds like, okay, there's always a learning happening, yeah, on the way you're trying something, and then you discover there's an additional benefit or another way of doing it. Since we were starting off the discussion with the question of do we do enough, and it's enough money, and what's the role of the Public Development Bank. So what do you expect from Stefan Wintels and his bank to do better so that what you are already doing successfully becomes bigger?
So two things. One is, you know, we've done a couple of these debt swaps. Our other partners have done more, but there's huge opportunity. We did the math that we think that there's about somewhere between $650 and $800 billion worth of emerging market debt that is addressable through this model. The limiting factor is credit enhancement, and so that's what the MDBs can do. There was a great announcement last week from a number of the MDBs going to form a task force to look at what they can do to scale up credit enhancement. Because we think providing guarantees to leverage private investment in lower cost debt is probably the most efficient use of public capital to leverage private capital into the space. So that's how you scale up the debt for nature swap. The other thing, I think there's still some work to be done here, is getting the MDBs or all the DFC, or even all of the public development banks to understand what is the nature positivity of their portfolios, right? There's lots of work done at a project level. Mm-hmm. We have safeguards. We can start to measure, as we hear, like the impact of any particular project and how it's nature positive. Add that all up at the portfolio level, though, right? Mm-hmm. Banks have started making commitments around the portfolio level impact on climate change and how much of their portfolio is going to be invested towards a net zero future. Ultimately, it should be 100%, right? Because there is no other future that we want. But the same with making the portfolio nature positive as a whole. And you know, last week there was an announcement from some of the MDBs starting to come up with some principles on how they might do that. But the CBD last year was asking the banks, all of the banks, as well as the G7, to come up with commitments on how they're going to do that at a portfolio level. So fine for principles. Mm-hmm. Now do your homework on what's your baseline so you can then set targets to go beyond the baseline towards actually improving the nature positivity of the whole portfolio.
Okay, so these are a couple of asks to Mr. Wintels. Yeah, so if you have an answer, please give it to us. Otherwise, you shoot back a question to Andrew.
That's a nice exercise. I don't think that we are at the center of the debt swaps, given our role as a national DFI. Intellectually, I'm curious whether we can scale this, but at the moment, I don't think we are at the center, quite frankly. The second point or request we are addressing by our biodiversity roadmap, which we hope to finalize by mid-next year. And clearly, the idea is that we create assess the positive impact, that we are assessing the negative impact, and that we have an advanced disclosure as a starting point, and do not wait for regulation. So there's a huge commitment by the board to move into that direction, and therefore it's positive. My question to whomever, if that is now the role play, is if I understand your examples, Andrew, it's in my simple words nothing else than you internalize the negative effects of the behavior, which easily could have been done with CO2 pricing, etc., on a project level or on a regional level. How do you scale this with a speed that we have a material progress? Because currently all these great initiatives are regional, are local, and hardly to find private capital. If the hotel owners are willing to charge their clients $1 more for a night and then pay it for the reservation, great example, and that's how it should be. But how can we move to the next level? Or do you think it will remain project by project based?
So my short answer is I'm not sure the private market's going to get there on its own, because ultimately what we're looking for is investment in a public asset or a public good or the services that are provided. So I have put much more faith in regulated requirements or regulated markets. So disclosure, but in effect make it mandatory, right? So that a requirement that companies have to assess and disclose their risks on nature, but understand the impacts that they have and set positivity targets that they have to improve the nature positivity of their outcomes over time. And I don't think we get there in a voluntary world. I don't think biodiversity credits or certificates or is going to get us there. The voluntary carbon market's not going to get us there. A price on carbon would get us there. And as I say, the analogy in the biodiversity world of being and because the problem with biodiversity is, everyone knows, right? There is no simple metric. You have CO2 that is fungible geographically. Biodiversity isn't. It's sort of site specific and sector specific. But some kind of requirements for mandatory disclosure and reduction of negative impacts and improvement of positive impacts at the corporate level, at least for large companies, was called for in the Global Biodiversity Framework. The Business for Nature coalition of companies is trying to figure out how we do this and get companies to set targets to do that over time. But voluntary is not going to get us there.
So I saw.
If I may add one thing.
Sorry, Leslie. Yeah.
Sorry, just to add one thing, maybe there's this amazing organization called the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge and Foundation, to which we are part of. It's more than 135 members. It's all asset managers, public, private banks, pension funds, and impact investors like us. And the whole point of this pledge and foundation is to find those solutions to measure biodiversity. So this organization has been really impressive in the way that they really become a voice on biodiversity, and they involve in many of the discussion around TNFD, SBTN. So I know KfW is not part of this association, but I'm sure I will strongly recommend anyone in the room to be part of this group, because I'm really impressed on the progress that they've made. The only reason we join as a small VC fund, venture capital fund, is to make sure that the private markets are heard, because often we're forgotten because we're really small. But I do believe that we are a part of the solution, because we are investing in those small, innovative, disruptive, and scalable solutions that will transition the agri-food sector. And it's not the current players today that can do that. We need those innovative young startups. And that's the reason why we joined, to make sure that impact investors have a voice as well on biodiversity, because I think we're part of the solution.
Can you repeat the name of that association?
It's Finance for Biodiversity. There's the pledge, which you can be a signatory, and there's the foundation, and the foundation help these signatories to the forefront of biodiversity.
All right, thank you very much. So you were motivated to comment on what has been discussed.
Yes.
I could see that.
No, I thank you very much, Andrew. Very interesting proposals, but I fear that we could create kind of parallel world with this kind of new concept, instruments, KPIs, that could be far away from the country's needs. My experience is that it's very, very difficult. Probably you have the same experience when you talk with the stakeholders. it's very difficult to really make them understand the relevance of biodiversity. I think we need to learn the language much more and to talk at a sectoral level. For instance, I'm thinking in the agricultural sector, which is really crucial for the loss of biodiversity. And we have been talking of fossil fuel subsidies, and we need also to talk about agricultural subsidies that are against the biodiversity. And these are the questions that we really need to put on the table when we talk with the countries. And how, for instance, to avoid deforestation, which is one of the main causes of biodiversity and also of climate change. When we have been subsidizing or promoting subsidies to the bad practices in agriculture, now we are requesting to change and to go for a more agroecological transition. And I think that we need really to learn all this very much, and we need to provide with enabling conditions for the countries to really understand what are we talking about. Institutions, regulations, as has been told. I think that perhaps we need to avoid some of the mistakes that we made in climate change, because it's true that we have made good progress, but we are still very far away from the 1.5 degrees. So something is wrong. So let's try to work in a different manner and try and work much harder with the countries, with the stakeholders, to really involve the communities, to really understand what are we talking about. And I think that the TNC is working very much on that, but sometimes we need to really work further in making the countries understand what is this biodiversity or no. We are talking about nature, we are talking about agriculture. Another important thing is that we should talk about the regulations, the trade regulations in the European Union, the relevance of this deforestation regulation on the agriculture in the country. So it's that we created a problem, and now we are trying to have the solution, and we are creating another problem. So I think that sometimes it's very difficult for the countries to understand what should I do? They requested me to have palm oil, and now the palm oil is really very bad for the biodiversity, it's bad for the communities. So perhaps we need to go a step behind and trying to really understand that the biodiversity loss is the quality of life loss. It's not only, of course, is the biodiversity loss, but I think we need to really have a very close conversations, and some of the organizations are doing very well, but sometimes the institutions, we need to also to develop instruments to really land our conversations with stakeholders. This is my point. Thank you.
Maybe that's an opportune time to put in a little advertisement block here, because IDFC as a group has working groups. Yeah? So the banks have joined on a voluntary basis to form working groups. There's a climate change working group, there's a biodiversity working group, and they've also issued a position paper. Yeah? I would say it's still not really very concrete in terms of what activities we are going to do, not in the sense of a biodiversity roadmap, yeah, or a transformation roadmap, but it's commitment. Yeah? So there's a commitment by IDFC of the 26 member banks to work on these topics. Yeah, and actually there's also some sort of a pledge to mobilize $100 billion of funding until 2027 for this, which I think if we look at 18 billion in 2022, yeah, it shows that there is at least some ambition in this. So that's one advertisement I wanted to make. The other one is that we issued, or KPMG actually issued a paper together with KfW last week, yeah, which is kind of an overview of existing instruments in private sector, public sector, joint financing of biodiversity and climate activities. Yeah, so it has a strong focus on biodiversity benefits, but there's a lot of it in it also in the climate space. And it also mentions, for example, the debt swaps as an instrument. So it's a paper, you can find it online. Yeah, I don't have it with me, but it's something where we start working as KfW, in this case together with KPMG, on these kind of papers. So something is happening, and I think that's encouraging. Yeah, and we talked about the needs, and Professor Pertner let us know how urgent everything is and that everything is connected. Yeah, but then as a public bank, but other players as well, you have to always slice this complexity in order to make it investable. Yeah, and I think that's a big job that we all have in our hands, and to put a foundation under it that is strategic, that gives us the framework and the guidelines in order to take the right decisions. Yeah. So I would suggest that, oh, there's someone who wanted to make a comment on my advertisement.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question. I mean,
Sure.
I heard about investments into coral reefs and into coastal protection, and that is very important and very useful, no question about it. But these systems are at risk under climate change, and the projection is that even in a 1.5 degree warmer world, we are going to lose 70 to 90% of the world's warm water coral reefs. So just to take this as an example, you could, when you think about restoring ecosystems, you may not be able to restore them in the places where they were. They may be at risk. How do you do the risk assessment? And how does this influence, and how do you make sure that you do the right financial decisions in terms of outcome of the project? Is there a mechanism in place? Is there sort of a methodology book that you have available that you consult under those?
Would be nice.
Yeah.
And what we do, if I can use the analogy, that for climate risk assessment, KfW uses Munich Re database. Yeah, and then they have all these scenarios for 20, 50 years under different RCPs, and so we can select from that because somebody else has the data, yeah, and helps us identifying location-specific risk for our investments. We don't have that for biodiversity. So if you have it somewhere, or Andrew, you're working on this, let us know. Yeah, I think that's really crucial. Yeah, it's a territorial topic like in climate risk. Yeah. And it's something with scenarios for the future, so we have to think about, okay, timelines. Yeah, so for our investments in financial cooperation, we usually work with 20 years, yeah, because we say the asset we create will deliver for 20 years, yeah, so that's our timeline. I don't know whether that's appropriate for biodiversity and ecosystems, yeah, but we don't have the data. So I don't know, is anyone here on the panel who has an idea on this? Andrew?
Okay, so biodiversity metrics is a little beyond my area of expertise, but no, this is a very much the state-of-the-art conversation, particularly coming out of the Global Biodiversity Framework and with the development of the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and the Science-Based Targets Network, right, of trying to come up with, if we're expecting companies to disclose, what are they disclosing on? How are they measuring that? How are they measuring impact? And again, the challenge is with biodiversity, there's not one metric the way there is with carbon. And so trying to get to what are the metrics, and I have to, with all due respect to the scientists in my own organization tend to get really specific about, you know, the place where they do their work, and the question becomes scalability, right? Is how good is good enough for financial decision making compared to measuring the habitat of a particular species or the ecosystem services, but how good is good enough to make financial decisions, and at what resolution? And I'm hopefully others looking at the screen here.
Leslie, yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I'm happy to add on that as well. I think the one specificity as well, like from biodiversity, is that compared to greenhouse gas emission, where it's a global problem, biodiversity and freshwater use are extremely local. So when you look at the solution in which we invest, we have to think about the fact that, you know, replacing meat in Asia, in Australia, in Africa, or in Europe is not going to have the same impact. So we need to be extremely careful to assess those metrics in their local environment. At the same time, I fully agree that it's extremely difficult, but we have to start. We've been doing that for 5 years, and the learning we had over the last 5 years has been enormous. I'm not saying that we have nailed it down, but I'm really pleased to say that, you know, when we make an investment, we have a good understanding of the net impact positive potential of this deal. We really build beforehand what we call impact pathways, where we're going to assess the impact that this investment is going to have on nature, social, and human capital. Because again, we should, the same way that, we've been focused on greenhouse gas emissions for years, now finally people are looking at biodiversity, but we need to be careful to not forget about the people. So I think it's the most important is to be holistic when we think about impact. And I agree, it's not like an easy recipe, but I'm sure that if we all put the effort and if all we incentivize and regulation goes into this direction, we'll get there pretty quickly and much faster than we have progressed on greenhouse gas emissions.
Thank you.
I definitely agree with that approach, where it's dynamic and the context of the environment, that we are in, drives it. I mean, I come from a continent where generally capital dictates what has to be done as opposed to our own, the needs of the people, dictating what capital is then suitable. And I think as we go along this journey, it's really going to be critical that we adopt that dynamic approach around impact as well, and that is actually going to be quite a powerful tool going forward. But the one point that I don't want us to miss, which he then touched on, is cities at the center of nature finance, and that is something that within the African context, we know that by 2050, 1.5 billion people are going to be living in African cities, and that's why it's going to be important, as a development finance institution that mainly finances, the number one priority is funding for cities. It's going to be critical how we actually structure funding and embed the biodiversity element. We have done that in a recent transaction that we did with one of our cities in South Africa around securing the aqueducts to then say a portion of that, like 5% of the funding actually has to go towards protecting biodiversity element, and then instead of getting a financial return, it's we then get a development return. And I think return matrices, especially on the private sector side, also need to be re-looked at, for us to really achieve net zero by 2050. Thanks.
Very well. So I was before trying to close this on a positive note, so I can try it again. I feel it's I really like this. It was a really rich exchange with many perspectives and ideas and good examples, private sector, conservation, public development banks, and science. I think we also discovered that we have a lot of nuts to crack, and that pretty quickly, and we don't have all the solutions at hand right now, but we have bits and pieces with which we can work. And so just as a closing, I was wondering whether we all meet again at COP16, biodiversity, and have a similar discussion there, then based on the biodiversity convention, and not as here on the climate change convention. Will the discussion be different, or are we ready that we have the same discussion at a different location? What do you think? Will be different? Okay. Why? So what you say is we've made progress until then, and then we have a different discussion.
Yes, no, definitely.
That's the positive note I wanted to hear. That's great. So I think good hand for our panel, for the rich discussion. Thank you very much to all of you and the people online who attended, and I really enjoyed this. Have a good afternoon.
Climate strategy, offering trainings on climate risk assessment, climate strategies, and adaptation, supporting events and partnerships to the international agenda, mobilizing resources and facilitating joint business opportunities and project proposal.